Hello and welcome to WePC Benchmarks. My name is Seb, and today I'm taking a look at the new remaster of Diablo 2, Resurrected, and benchmarking it with 11 GPUs to see how well it performs. Similar to Warzone, Blizzard seems to use the same anti-cheat, which means our overlay does not work in the game, and so I had to use the AMD and Nvidia overlays, which lack all the information we usually provide you with, so we just have an FPS counter to use. The settings I used for the game were set to very high at full screen, and of course, benchmarked it at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. Well, we start off with the RTX 3090, and at 1080p it averages 295 FPS. Moving up, and at 1440p it gives us an average of 193 FPS. And then at 4K we get an average of 117 FPS. Next up is the RX 6900 XT, and at 1080p it averages 254 FPS. Then at 1440p, the card averages 192 FPS. And then at 4K, it averages 120 FPS. The next GPU is the RTX 3080, and at 1080p, it averages 262 FPS. And then at 1440p, the card averages at 155 FPS. And at 4K, it averages 90 FPS. Up next is the RX 6800 XT, and at 1080p, it averages 228 FPS. Moving up to 1440p, and it averages 178 FPS. And then at 4K, it averages to 74 FPS. Then is the RTX 3060 Ti, and the card averages 164 FPS at 1080p. Then at 1440p, the card averages 113 FPS. Then at 4K, it averages to 57 FPS. The RX 6600 XT is next, and at 1080p, the average is 151 FPS. Moving up to 1440p, the card averages 122 FPS. And at 4K, the card averages 43 FPS. Next up is the RTX 2070 Super, and at 1080p, it averages at 151 FPS. Moving up to 1440p, and it averages 94 FPS. And then at 4K, it averages 54 FPS. Moving on to the RX 5700 XT, and at 1080p, it averages 153 FPS. Then at 1440p, it averages 138 FPS. And at 4K, it averages 42 FPS. Up next is the GTX 1660 Ti, and at 1080p, it averages 80 FPS. Moving up to 1440p, and it averages 55 FPS. And then at 4K, it averages 31 FPS. The next GPU is the RX 580, and at 1080p it averages 90 FPS. Moving up to 4040p, it averages 70 FPS. And at 4K, it averages 55 FPS.
I can't carry anymore.
And lastly, we have the GTX 1050 Ti, and at 1080p it averages 33 FPS. Up to 4040p, and it averages 21 FPS. And then at 4K, it averages 10 FPS. Of course, you can always push G and immediately switch to legacy mode and experience the smoothest of frame rates with any hardware. As you can see now at 4K, our 1050 Ti is well over 700 FPS. So there you have it, Diablo 2 Resurrected. The new remaster is fairly well optimized, and even at 4K, all the new gen cards can run it around 60 FPS, and even older stuff can manage fairly well. At 1080p, it only drops below 60 with the 1050 Ti, and so it is fairly good for most hardware. And even so, you can always turn on legacy mode and play it on pretty much anything. Hopefully this video has been helpful, and thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.